Let's focus our attention on something else now. The Interim Board of South African Airways has welcomed the publication of the first part of the report of the Judicial Commission of Inquiry into allegations of state capture. The SAA Interim Board and management says they are currently reviewing the report, which has been released as part one of the three-part report on corruption and fraud activities that took place between individuals, public and private sector entities. SAA says it will cooperate with the country's law enforcement in implementing recommendations related to South African Airways and its associated companies. Chartered accountant and political commentator Khaya Sithole joins us now to give us a little bit of analysis. Khaya, great to see you, and thanks very much for being with us. And I don't know when I must stop saying compliments, but compliments to you for 2022.
Thank you, and good morning to the viewers.
All right, so what did you make of the SAA statement, which seemed a bit safe and scanty on detail?
Yeah, it did feel like a bit of a tentative statement, but I suspect the bigger problem here is that even before the publication of the Zondo Commission report, an organization like SAA ought to have done enough of its own internal work to figure out how exactly it ended up in the position that it was in, and to then figure out what it needed to do in order to improve its own internal governance systems so that it never ever finds itself in the position that it's in. It's also quite important to note, of course, that SAA is probably the clearest exhibit of what precisely happens when things do go wrong at the governance level, because unlike all the other institutions that are mentioned in the Zondo Commission report, it is the one where essentially things became so bad, it had to essentially be folded as a form of a business, and it went into a business rescue process so that it could emerge as something completely different, as something shaped a bit differently. So if there's one institution that understands, or at least ought to understand exactly what it is that the Zondo Commission process is trying to unpack, it has to be SAA itself. So the board saying that they're going to comply with the law enforcement authorities, well, firstly, they do not have a choice. But what was missing from that statement is a very clear explanation of what have they done since they sort of figured out exactly what the scale of the problem that SAA had been from the testimonies that we heard over the past 3 years.
Yeah, I mean, within this, SAA says it will be cleaning the company of all leftovers of its shameful past, to quote them, as exposed in the Commission report. Who exactly are they referring to? I mean, is this people that are still within the company?
The most important thing that emerges from the Zondo Commission report is that whilst the report does indeed identify the key figureheads in the rotting of such institutions, none of these individuals could have ever achieved any of the things that they managed to do without either the complicity or the assistance of people within the value chain. So, of course, we may be talking about Dudu Myeni or even Yake Gwinana, but they were never employees of SAA. In fact, they were non-executive directors, which simply means that whatever it is that they're being accused of having executed that amounts to an element of malfeasance, we need to figure out exactly who were the internal stakeholders, who were the internal individuals that were enabling them to be able to do this. The most ironic thing that came from the SAA press statement yesterday is that if you look at the footnote there at the very bottom, they do mention that the company secretary is Ruth Kibuga. And of course, if you read the Zondo Commission report and if you understand any of the things that have been said about SAA, that is the same company secretary who was there throughout. And of course, that on its own does not elevate that person into a guilty status. But the reality here is that this was one individual who, either through not doing enough to scream out and say that things are not happening the way that they should be, or feeling disempowered enough, was part of that system. So if that individual is there, you can imagine how many other individuals have survived this and still exist within the supply chain processes of SAA in particular. And unfortunately, it will be in the interest of SAA to essentially identify all of these individuals, figure out whether it's desirable for them to continue to become members of the SAA workforce, and if not, they have to get rid of them.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite amazing that this particular first document that's been handed over from the inquiry, I mean, literally half of it is about SAA. So there's a lot to wade through in terms of what was done at SAA. But the reality is that it's not a very rosy picture at all. I mean, workers' unions at SAA also lamenting the fact that they are being retrenched, while SAA is actually still hogging those that have contributed to the collapse of the entity. Why haven't they been dealt with? I mean, or was the company actually waiting for this official report to act on it?
No, the company cannot argue that it was waiting for this report to act on the things that it has to be dealing with on an ongoing basis. So the primary problem here, of course, is that there is an intersection between SAA to try and reform itself and the fact that SAA as a business is no longer viable. So then the question of, do they even have the type of resources that are necessary in order for them to conduct a complete overhaul and a complete cleanup? That is something only the interim board can answer to. My suspicion is that obviously the attention has been primarily focused on trying to figure out what the SAA of the future ought to look like. Of course, the irony is that they wouldn't be talking about SAA of the future had the previous governance lapses not happened in the first place. We do know that at some point in time, they did employ Khaya Sithole himself to sort of try and help them out. We are not sure exactly what it is that he has uncovered at this stage or what it is that has been implemented as recommendations. And sometimes it will be very difficult for us to know whether an individual has left SAA because something has been discovered relating to their prior conduct, or simply it's a natural progression from the business rescue process where, of course, we know many people lost their jobs as a consequence of the business being reshaped and being repurposed differently. And it will be in the interest of SAA to be a bit more clear and to articulate exactly what it is that they've sort of done in relation to the cleanup process. But it is not up to them to say that they're waiting for the Zondo Commission report. The Zondo Commission report does not impose or implore anyone to defer their own internal processes, particularly their own businesses that put to the ground like SAA.
Yeah. So I mean, in the statement, the board actually says that it will pursue prosecutions where necessary and will institute internal investigations as well as disciplinary proceedings against those that have been implicated. Now, would you say that SAA has been strengthened and capacitated enough now to institute such?
Absolutely not. And I suppose we have to be very careful about all these organizations saying that they're going to institute prosecutions. None of these institutions are going to institute any prosecutions. And that's when the long shadow of Shamila Batohi and the NPA comes into the conversation, because naturally such institutions either do not have the legal mandate or even the resources to do so, to then simply say that this person needs to be prosecuted in one way or another. What they can commit to doing is to then say, well, now that we actually sort of know who are the individuals that are in the spotlight we're in a position to furnish the NPA in particular with additional insights and additional data in order to enable them to pursue a successful prosecution. So it's that assistance that they should be offering, but for them to issue statements that they're going to pursue prosecutions as if that lies within their ambit may be a bit misleading. On the internal processes, of course, we do know that they're all going to undertake some form of disciplinary processes, and as a consequence of that, people may emerge as, on the other side, clean or confirmed as having been complicit in the destruction of the company itself. The problem is that society has elevated its own expectations in that if you see a report that mentions people having done things and people having committed actions that lead to losses of over 800 million rand in one particular instance, it is probably not going to be sufficient to say that an individual involved in that process has essentially undergone a disciplinary process and the result was XYZ. The scale of the losses and the scale of the looting is so great, people have an expectation that it is actually going to end up with a proper trial rather than an internal disciplinary process whose results and whose merits or otherwise we may never get to see.
So Khaya, obviously we read, and in very clear writing, the scathing words that have been put towards Dudu Myeni. I mean, just some of it just saying she's a negative force bulldozing her way through the state-owned entity for her benefit and the benefit of those connected to others connected. She had corrupt intent. She was meddling, incompetent. These are just some of the words that have been used to talk about the chairmanship of Dudu Myeni. And it's clear, the report is clear on its recommendations of prosecutions of the former board chair and Yake Kwinana. But what about ministers who were at the helm at the time? I mean, let's talk about Malusi Gigaba. What happens there?
Unfortunately, the problem here is that our politicians have mastered the art of plausible deniability. In other words, it is very unlikely that you're going to find a very cogent audit trail that says it was indeed Melusi Gigaba who instructed XYZ to do this in order for them to achieve a particular outcome. And not only have they mastered that art of plausible deniability, they also have really mastered the skill of ensuring that whoever they put in charge of those particular activities are the people that have a great sense of loyalty towards these individual politicians. So it's very unlikely that they're going to unilaterally overnight turn against the politicians and say exactly what it is that the politicians instructed them to do. So if you go through the testimony of SAA in particular, you're going to see that there's various hints, whether it comes from the testimony of Cheryl Carolas herself or whether it comes from the testimony of Vuyisile Kona. There will be very strong hints that we do think that the minister either was in cahoots with these individuals or the minister supported these individuals. But there's no way you're going to launch a successful prosecution of Melusi Gigaba by simply arguing that in a meeting with Jet Airways, he ought to have been more resistant, he ought to have been stronger in defending the interests of SAA compared to the interests of Jet Airways. Not much turns on that except for the fact that perhaps he was a minister who was disinterested and disengaged in his job. So I do think that the politicians are probably going to survive this because over time they've mastered the art of ensuring that plausible deniability is always going to be their trump card, and there's perhaps no clearer exhibition of that than the fact that absolutely nothing ties Melusi Gigaba to any particular document or any particular transaction, except for the fact that the people in the room say they were still horrified by the way he conducted or failed to that himself.
Just very quickly before I let you go, because it is important, and you brought it up right at the beginning of the interview. I mean, this SAA interim board was appointed in December 2020, exactly a year into the business rescue, which kicked in and around about December 2019. And most of their tenure fell within the business rescue process. But is there anything remarkable at all that you can say about them during their tenure at SAA?
Oh, and unfortunately, during a business rescue process, the powers of the board are essentially non-existent because the business rescue team is fully in charge of trying to figure out what to do and how to do that. So for a very long time, they were simply paralyzed by processes. And beyond that, after the business rescue process was indeed completed, it then turned out that the state had taken the view that they actually wanted to pursue an equity transaction, which has been the new fixation in trying to figure out, well, what should the business look like in order for it to be attractive to investors? We do now know that the Department of Public Enterprises has identified a potential suitor through the Dakato Consortium. Quite surprisingly, though, we haven't heard much from the moment that announcement was made. So we're still all trying to figure out what it is that needs to be done. But unfortunately, this board of SAA has really had its powers limited by not only the business rescue process, but also by the impending transaction. Zero expectations, and I can't say they've actually delivered anything beyond what was expected.
All right, Khaya, we'll leave it there. Listen, good luck for your exams. I know that you're writing today, so wishing you all the very, very best. And thanks so much for taking your mind off of that and putting it onto SAA. Now you can go away for a while and study and sharpen those edges on your pencils. Thanks again. Thanks very much, Khaya.